Alleluia. Om Mani Padme. Om. Allah.
Welcome. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. We're speaking with David Leonard. He's the Manager of Community Engagement at the Dispute Settlement Centre of Victoria. When we spoke to you last week, you gave a bit of an outline of what the Dispute Centre does. Could you just give a brief, just for someone who didn't see that program? What does it do?
Okay. It's a government program that helps people solve their own disputes. So it's been set up by the Department of Justice to try and keep people away from the rest of the justice system, from the police and the courts, that kind of thing. So it's early dispute prevention and conflict resolution, best known for mediation.
Thank you. And it's a very important process, particularly in Melbourne, because on the level of multicultural, Melbourne is up internationally, up there, up the top there somewhere. In mediating for disputes, how do you handle that linguistic, cultural differences? Because you're bound to encounter them, surely.
Well, the first thing we have to try and do is make sure that our service is accessible to communities. So we have a range of brochures in different community languages, and we spend a lot of time talking to the various agencies that work with the different linguistic communities to make sure people even know the service is there.
Right.
We have about 100 mediators on our book. They work on a casual basis, and when we run a mediation, there's usually 2 mediators. So we do try and reflect the community and have as diverse a mediation population as we can.
Yeah.
But of course, when it comes to the linguistic aspect of things, if a person is not from an English-speaking background, then we'll always offer an interpreter.
Yes.
And we would prefer to err on the side of providing an interpreter than not providing one.
Right.
Because often when you're in a conflict situation, it's sometimes easier to go back to your first language, so we'd rather have an interpreter than not. There is always the issue that words can get lost in translation, so we use the NATI 3 standard interpreter wherever we can. And we use phone interpreting whenever we have dealings with clients as well, to make sure that we're getting the best information we can.
Right. And that's generally successful. You don't. I'm thinking about cultural implications. If you have a cultural advisor, because of the various different ways in which relationships occur within different cultures.
Yes, I mean there are unique challenges. Some of those being even in our population pool in Victoria, you can have people who know the people who are coming to the mediation. So in small rural communities, often we'll have to try and get an interpreter from another part of Victoria to come into there, so that we've got that neutrality. In terms of the cultural aspect, because there's the linguistic aspect, but there's also cultural ways that people might communicate, assumptions they might make about what a neighbourly relationship should be. So the idea of having a diverse mediator pool is that the mediators might figure there's a misunderstanding here, so they might ask the questions. They wouldn't tell the individuals in the dispute, oh, he's thinking this and he's thinking that, because they might not be thinking that, but they can ask that question, they can raise that up. So, and that's not just, I guess, in terms of our different cold communities also too. We have a few Indigenous mediators as well, and we try to have other groups represented, because sometimes there's that cultural aspect that lies underneath a dispute.
Yes, but your management is of community engagement.
Yes.
This would be pretty much part of the thrust of what you're on about, wouldn't it?
It is, and part of the difficulty sometimes is that mediation might not be the thing that people need. So there might be a broader aspect of communication, like in a large ethnically based organisation, there might just be a general breakdown in communication or organisation. So we might have a facilitated meeting instead of a mediation. Or we might come in and do some work around what communication means for that group.
Yeah.
We talk about engagement, though. It's not just, I guess, us coming and telling a community. Often we will just want to find out from a community what are the kind of conflicts they have, what are the mechanisms they have to resolve that. They might have community leaders, and there might be ways that we can support them rather than saying you have to use our service.
Right. That's a very critical operation that you're carrying out there, because if you can get that communication between, if you call them elders or older representatives, whatever they call them, or priests, or however they do it, that's building a fabric, and that's the community engagement fabric which you're on about. So
yes,
it's very very important.
Yes, and the way we have to do that is through community partnerships. So if we just stayed in our offices in Melbourne, we can do our mediations, but it's also important that we go to the various parts of Victoria and speak to the communities in their own location and find out what's needed.
How do you find that the circulation of the linguistic pamphlets, etc., and the advice, is that generating more connection with those communities?
I think so, but I can only go, I guess, on interpreter data, that we're using more interpreters in our mediation, but it's also, I think, just that creating that awareness. It's like the famous quote about advertising, where half of it's extremely valuable, but you don't know which half. It's the same with community engagement. We're not quite sure what hits the mark and what doesn't sometimes. And when we're working in partnership with community partners, they've got their own way of doing business, so we need to be flexible.
Yes, you've mentioned regional several times. Do you find the regions use it more frequently? They
have been. We have we have 13 regional offices across 5 rural regions. So we have offices in Geelong and Warrnambool in the Barwon southwest, and we have offices in Ballarat, and a team of people in that area.
And we have to go to a break. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. We're speaking with David Leonard. He's the Manager of Community Engagement at the Dispute Settlement Centre of Victoria. And David, we were talking about your community engagement programs. You gave some interesting examples earlier of mediation. Can you give some examples of way this engagement process works?
All right. One group that we identified a while back was the newly arrived communities of Victoria are less likely to be looking up the Dispute Settlement Centre in the phone book or on the internet. They probably wouldn't have any idea that there was a Dispute Settlement Centre of Victoria. So we went and spoke to the Karen Association of Australia, and when we talked about what our service was, and we said, have you had an experience of that in your country? They said, well, we don't actually have a direct way to translate the word conflict or dispute, and when it comes to even getting into conflict with our neighbours, we don't know what we can do, what we can't do.
Oh, yes.
So we realised what was needed was broader community education around the different services. So we partnered up with police and local laws, and we had a forum for their community. And then what we found out was that advertising, the best way was to actually go through the church groups, because that's where a lot of the community got their information about services. So not the traditional way that we had thought through the information cycles of the Law Foundation and those kind of things, but through the church groups. We also found that the people that we needed to target were both the elder members of the community, but also the young adults who were
Yeah.
taking the church groups, because they were the ones who were the sort of the language bridge
Yes.
between the Australian community and the Karen community.
Mm.
So we had both community education, and we also did a little bit of a workshop.
Mhm.
And one thing that came through our discussion with them, we had to throw out a lot of our material because we're always assuming that conflicts are aggressive kind of encounters.
Yeah.
But for the Karen, the biggest hurdle was even just talking to your neighbour and bringing up an issue. So the difference
Yes.
between, say, being assertive and aggressive.
Mm. Mm.
So our Karen educator came up with an anecdote for everybody, talking about how she was in a share house and she was offered a cup of tea the first day she moved in, and she very politely refused.
Mm.
And after that she was never offered a cup of tea again. Because and that was enough to explain to people, the difference between assertive and aggressive. What she
Yes.
thought was, her being polite, they thought that she's not assertive.
Yes. Yes.
So often our community engagement takes us down different tangents that we're not aware of.
Mm. Yes, that's very, very detailed. You need to be extremely sensitive to a lot of those issues. That's remarkable. Now, talking about issues that you need to be sensitive to, I think you do, or the organisation does work in relation to older Australians.
That's right.
Moving in with their children, etc.
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Well, it's a growing need because the Senior Rights Victoria often started referring cases to us where people had sold their house, downsized, moved in with their children, often investing substantial amounts of money either to renovate the house or to put a granny flat at the back. There'd been no discussion about whether there was a legal interest created in the children's property, and then the usual issues of cohabitation arose about the responsibility for childcare, transport, all those kinds of issues.
Yeah.
So when they were referred to us, they were often very difficult to mediate because at that point it was beyond the point of no return.
Yeah. Mm.
So we've been promoting more family meetings to say we don't need to be in a dispute to use a dispute settlement centre, and you don't even need to use us, but you need to think about having, if you're going to make an important life decision like this, you need to have a meeting as a family and think through some of these issues.
Mm.
So part of this is simply promoting to the community, these are some of the things you need to talk about.
Right.
But also for us to provide a service, if need be, where people feel comfortable to raise those issues and those concerns, and there might be no issues. So it's a bit different from mediation, but at least people get the chance to clear the air.
That's part of community engagement. Is that bit, or is it a separate thing again?
Well, it's a bit of a blend, because the community engagement is about even getting people to think about these issues, but then there's direct service delivery if people want the family meeting.
So I've got the workable family agreement checklist here, which addresses, and it's quite impressive actually, the sorts of things like will Centrelink payments be affected by the new arrangement? They're basic ground issues, aren't they?
Yes.
So okay, there's that workable family agreements checklist. How does that get to families? How do you promote that?
Again, it's mainly through community partnerships. So through local government, the positive ageing, most governments, local government have positive ageing team, through community health care providers. We've been encouraging GPs, but we need to do more promotion there as well through the health system as well. And Senior Rights have also done a lot of work with the legal profession, because often that's when people consult their accountant or their lawyer, is when they're planning to make a move like this, but they don't necessarily discuss it with their children, and that's the issue too.
Sitting behind this seems to be a large network of awareness in government departments, in police forces and local council, etc. How's that managed? That's a big, it's a big network.
Yes. Through the police, they have, we're now on their VIPA system, so like victims referral and other services, we're sort of part of the technology, as it were, but a lot of it's just footwork and good old-fashioned communicating with other agencies and making sure that we're in touch with each other about those kind of issues.
Yes, well, your mention of technology is quite appropriate because there's a clock ticking and we're out of time. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back. You're watching Harmony and Diversity. And we're speaking with David Leonard. He's Manager of Community Engagement at the Dispute Settlement Centre of Victoria. The earlier conversation, it was clear that there's a lot of networking support which needs to be maintained for people to know of your service because you offer such an important one. What's the main way in which that is generated? What do you do to be able to be sure that across the board there is as much knowledge as possible?
Well, because we don't actually have a sort of an advertising budget, because we're not an organisation that's set up to inform the public, a lot of that is direct contact with the other services on the ground.
Yes.
Probably one thing that we don't have at the moment, for example, is a social media presence. We rely on other networks, council and the department. But it's an interesting thing because we provide a confidential service.
Yes.
So there's specific provisions of the Evidence Act that apply to us, and anything that's said to us by a client can't be disclosed without their permission.
Yes.
What we don't want to do is to have people who maybe haven't gone to mediation using a social media platform for the Dispute Settlement Centre to progress their disputes. So we sort of stayed away from that social media presence. The other interesting thing is that social media sometimes itself generates conflicts.
Yes.
So it's not an uncommon scenario for us where we will have two students at a high school that might have had a falling out in their peer group, and they've started to say nasty things about each other on social media, maybe even made threats. Then their parents, who are connected on social media, will join in on that conversation, and next minute the offline dispute becomes the online dispute becomes a fight offline. And then it comes to us through the court system. So I think the thing about us is we've always had a very strong point about face-to-face communication. That's the way that we help resolve disputes, and that's the way we get our message across as well.
Have you got an idea of the proportion of disputes or requests, at least, which come to you from the person picking up the phone, from court, from police? What does the breakdown look like?
About a quarter would be self-referred, so people coming through the information channels, so that might be internet usually, their own research endeavours. About another 3/5 or so would come from local government, and the rest is from police, community services, Office of Housing, those kind of agencies.
Right. So that's a fair spread.
Yeah.
But talking about media, do you find that media is always a benefit to you or not?
Look, it's interesting in the any medium to get the message out about awareness about our service is a positive thing. Sometimes, a message can be coupled, so you might get a dispute that's happened in another country or another state. It might be 5 years old, and the footage is put there against commentary from us about talking positively to your neighbours. But at the end of the day, at least that message is there.
Is there, yeah. Do you find that there's a sort of a surge in your work when there's tensions? Particularly, I'm talking here about international tensions, really, so that which then translates often into community tensions, into ethnic tensions, and we don't want to go right into all that stuff. But do you find that there's a movement, more intense times?
It is hard to say. I know our work is actually a bit more seasonal. That might be because, again, we're best known for neighbourhood disputes. So in the seasons where people are more out and about, they have more contact with each other. So spring and autumn are busier than winter and summer. In terms of those other drivers, they probably do, but there are so many variables, and it's about when people find out about the service as well. So things will happen in cycles with. So we may well do some community engagement. There might be a slight increase of calls from one particular community where we've just been speaking to them, but often there might be a lag because people might not actually have a dispute at the time we speak to them, but hopefully they'll remember us 6 months down the track.
When it comes through, yes. Just on that seasonal element of it too, with the family agreement, etc., and older people retiring into homes and relationships. Is there any movement in that, or like an increase in that? Do you see? It
is slow, and I understand that because I was thinking about it in terms of even my own family, that it takes a lot of trust.
Yes.
To take your personal family matter to an outside body. So I think we're putting a lot of concentration on more the preventative work and more the understanding what the issues you are to have in your own private discussion. So there's been a bit of a slow uptake.
Yes.
But I think a lot of people, it's a bit like the dental appointment. A lot of people agree it's necessary, but it's hard to book one.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, it's a wonderful service because that's the other end in society. Everybody gets older, and so that's an issue which is like a big lump at the end of the pathway. So you also will do court-based mediation in civil matters under $40,000. So that's court-related. They refer that to you, obviously.
So that's through practice directions mainly in those suburban courts, and now that's just part of the process, because in a lot of those smaller money matters there's not a lot of interlocutory steps. So the mediation's a very valuable tool in getting the parties to assess what the other person's offering and to settle.
I think you summed it up nicely, David. Mediation is a very valuable tool. We're out of time, but thank you so much for coming in.
It's been a pleasure.
Because it's a very illuminating and essential service. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
You've been watching Harmony and Diversity. Join us next week. Bye for now.
Baha'u'llah, Shanti Om.